And now we're going to talk a little bit about a different side of the South of Market. Those of you who know San Francisco know that the South of Market has many facets. Um, I was very fortunate in the 80s and 90s to enjoy some of the more underground elements of the neighborhood, um, which I'm going to be talking about in this video that you're going to be seeing. This video was developed by an amazing choreographer by the name of Amy Lewis, who has a company called Push Up Something Hidden. And what Amy specializes in is designing choreography for locations. And so she finds these amazing locations and she tells these stories about these different locations. And she invited me to be a collaborator in I believe it was 2016. Well, what she actually did was she gave me a bottle of wine and asked me to tell her some stories. And I guess I knew we were doing research, but yeah. So in the process of drinking that bottle of wine, I told many stories that at the time my family didn't really know about. That's changed since then. Um, and of course, her being a straight woman, I felt compelled to explain to her a lot of things about queer lifestyle. So luckily, I think this version of the video that you're going to see is going to be an R-rated version. There is an N-17 version of this piece somewhere. It was designed as a walking tour. So Amy and I wrote about 7 monologues that were performed at different locations in the South of Market. So an audience would actually follow me and I would tell stories about things that happened to me in these particular buildings. And then Amy and her collaborator, Agnes, wrote a lot of historical text about the neighborhood. So as the viewers were following me through this Byzantine pathway through the South of Market, they were actually listening on the earbuds to a live stream that was both Agnes talking about the historical elements of the neighborhood and me talking about my biographical things in the neighborhood. So with that bottle of red wine, there was a tape recorder. And so everything was captured for posterity. So I'm really proud of this version that you're going to see. I'm proud of all versions. It was actually about an hour-long performance with all the walking. What you're going to see today is about a 12-minute excerpt. Some of Agnes's work, some of my work, some of my dancing at around 20 pounds ago. Definitely my pre-COVID pounds. So I think it'll be a really, hopefully illuminating experience for you to see this video. So I think the library has this ready for us. And if we're going to play it, now would probably be a good time.
I'll go ahead and start it.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
SOMA was still populated by working-class men, many that were retired, when the area was approved for redevelopment. Official displacement of the residents began in 1967 and accelerated in 1968 and 69 as the redevelopment agency went in and bought hotels and other buildings and clear land wherever it could. Desperate for affordable and safe housing in the same general neighborhood, the residents of SOMA banded and formed the tenants and owners in opposition to redevelopment, or TOR. With the goal of establishing adequate relocation housing for the South of Market residents, TOR filed suit against the redevelopment agency demanding alternative housing in the same neighborhood so that residents could maintain their current way of life. Gail Rubin discusses how redevelopment and the ensuing lawsuits created space for the leather community. During the period of political and legal wrangling, the old neighborhood was significantly dismantled. Housing was demolished and entire streets disappeared. But the construction of new office towers and public buildings awaited the outcome of litigation, so the new neighborhood remained largely unrealized. The hiatus in redevelopment created a vacant or underused urban niche with plenty of empty buildings, both residential and commercial. Rents and land values were cheap. Street life at night was sparse. South of Market became a kind of urban frontier. The area began to attract artists looking for affordable studio space, musicians in search of practice venues, squatters who occupied the abandoned factories, and gay men. The relative lack of other nighttime activity provided a kind of privacy, an urban nightlife that was stigmatized or disreputable, flourished in relative obscurity among the warehouses and deserted streets.
These leather bars would have back rooms where you could have sex. So it was much easier. Like, you just chat someone up for 5 minutes, go to the back room and have sex in the back room. And that was it. Eventually, sexual.
Sometimes it helps if we all shut our
Liberation
cameras
happened
off.
in the 60s. And then leather sex started to emerge, and leather sex is sort of S&M, bondage and discipline, leather sex, leather vests, chaps, stuff like that. Leather sex is more what we call power play. So it's about one person being a dominant personality and one person being a recessive, or what we call sub. But that kind of started going away during the AIDS scare. So that kind of started disappearing in the mid-80s. But in the late 60s and the 70s, all these men that had been going up the North Beach and Polk Street were sort of like, oh, it's a sexual liberation. I don't have to pretend like I'm going to wear a sweater and go to what we call a sweater bar. A lot of people that were participating in leather sex didn't want to deal with condoms. There were a lot of drugs. And so condom use and drug usage don't go well together. So there were a lot of drugs in the South of Market. And so what happened was a lot of the leather men went underground. A lot of them passed away. But then the leather bars started going away because that community started shrinking. And then the internet emerged. And then the internet had a huge impact also, because in the 60s and the 70s, there was like a whole art of cruising. When the internet came out, that generation that grew up in the internet didn't really learn how to cruise, because they started having sex online, because there were chat rooms and that sort of thing. And so you had these two things that were happening simultaneously. The AIDS crisis was wiping out a whole generation of leathermen, right? And then you had the younger generation emerging who didn't even know what leather sex was, unless it was, a porn video. I mean, that was it, really. By the late 90s, there was probably only 3 leather bars left. Now, with San Francisco kind of blowing up right now, there's a lot of new queer men that are coming here, and they're sort of like, I don't want to have sex on an app. I want to go to the South of Market. So the South of Market is having a little bit of a resurgence. And they do a lot of fundraising, and they create these really elaborate, intricate support systems where they're all friends and they all know each other, and that emerged out of the AIDS crisis because there was no one to take care of them. So during that period, they really had to learn how to take care of each other, because they were ostracized from their families. Their families in Montana were not going to fly to San Francisco and make sure you made it to your oncologist appointment at San Francisco General. Like, you'd call up your leather brother. I was sort of chill about the whole thing, and then my mom, I think, was suspicious, and I had porn magazines hidden in my room, and so she found my porn magazine, and so she told my dad, who was this conservative Italian Catholic, and so an alcoholic, and so my dad was just sort of he confronted me, and I was kind of confused. I didn't really understand why people were so. I was like, yeah, yeah. And so then my mom was crying, and she wanted me to go see a priest, and I told her she was out of her mind. So what would happen is flight attendants would have a 2-day layover, and instead of getting a room in the hotel at SFO, they would come into the city and they would stay at a bathhouse for 2 days. That's how crazy it was. And so the city passed a law that you had to be able to look over a door. And so when the health department walked through, they had to be able to shine a flashlight and make sure you were using a condom. So then in '82, the city sanctioned sex clubs. And so the city was like, right, here are the rules. If you want to have a sex club instead of a bathhouse, if you're willing to adhere to these rules that were devised by the health department. And so the city was like, this is a lot of work. We don't really have the staff to monitor these sex clubs. I mean, the city was so decimated by HIV. And what people don't understand is how expensive HIV and AIDS. The number of people that had to have health care. I mean, SF General like almost went under because there was no treatment. And so people didn't get better. You know, it wasn't a manageable disease. Like, the city was hemorrhaging. SF General basically became a hospice. Thousands of men dying a year. And so you had this whole community that was devastated, right? And so it impacted the whole city. I mean, the city like almost fell apart during that period. The city's now giving Truvada away for free. The misconception is that everyone's on Truvada, right? So having sex without a condom is fine. It's common now. But because most men who live in San Francisco have relatively low viral loads because HIV medicines are fairly accessible. So, I mean, I understand. I mean, the basic premise is if you're HIV, the odds are your viral load's going to be low because you've had access to free HIV meds, right? And if you're HIV negative, the odds are you're taking Truvada. So I think everyone's just assuming the odds are pretty good that those two things are happening. 5 days before my 18th birthday. So I graduated in June. My birthday was July 19th, and I think I had my first sexual experience like July 15th, something like that. And that's when I came out. Like, what was a weird experience? I had a supervisor. I worked at you know those places where they sell cattle food and feed and grain, Concord, like Hicksville, right? And so I had this supervisor that, so he was about like 10 years older than me. I was really naive. And so we had flirted back and forth. And then finally he invited me to hang out at his house and we were watching Monty Python's Left Right. And he kind of seduced me. Like I knew I was going to get seduced. So like it wasn't that big of a surprise, right? So, and then I got fired right after that because his boss, he wasn't the owner of the business. And so his boss figured out that we were sleeping together. Oh. And so I got fired like right away because they were really straight and conservative and they didn't like the idea that their supervisor was having sex with an underage because I didn't turn 18 for another 5 days. And we never had sex again. But I'm sure I didn't make it a secret that we had sex. It didn't occur to me to hide it. I think I was just gushing. Like, I was like, oh, this is such a cool thing. Like, everyone should know about it. Like, this really awesome thing happened last night. And I think I thought I had a boyfriend. I think that I was so, like, naive. I just think I thought we were boyfriends. And then I got fired, and he didn't, like, jump to my rescue or, like, want to talk to me again. But I wasn't devastated. I was just sort of like, oh, that sucks. Like, I guess I don't have a boyfriend, and I hate this job anyway, so... And then I discovered the primary sex club in the South of Market, which is called Blow Buddies, which is such a great name. And the city was excited about supporting Blow Buddies because they advocated oral sex. And the city made you give your telephone number back then because if the club discovered that there was an STD, they wanted everyone's telephone number so they could call everyone and say there was an STD breakout on the night that you visited the club. We'd really like you to come down to the clinic and get tested. So to this day, they make you sign in. Yeah, I've been going there probably 30 years. Yeah, no alcohol. The health department has it set up. So the health department kind of feels like alcohol impairs men's ability to make good choices. Mm-hmm. And then there's buckets with condoms and lube. Once safe sex guidelines were really clear, like late 80s, like everyone sort of knew what safe sex guidelines were, and the HIV meds started coming out, then the city kind of loosened up a little bit, and so clubs like Blow Buddies were allowed to have anal sex, but they still had the monitors walking through, and so the monitors would be like, if you were not using a condom, they would throw you out.
Gail Rubin describes the Folsom as a sexual center of San Francisco and the South of Market as an area that was symbolically and institutionally associated in the gay male community with sex. A decade later, everything changed. Rubin writes extensively about several factors that led to the diminished Leatherman community in the late 1980s. While the gay male population was hugely affected by the AIDS crisis, it was not the only reason that Leathermen were suddenly seen less frequently in SOMA. The closures of the bathhouses annihilated an important part of the gay male lifestyle, and redevelopment caused rents to skyrocket, forcing many leather bars and other leather businesses to shut down. SOMA became trendy, and throngs of heterosexual people began coming to the area to attend clubs like the DNA Lounge. Rubin explains that to get to the remaining leather bars, a gay man had to navigate through crowds that could be hostile and dangerous. However, the community was and is resilient. Rubin writes that while gay leather no longer dominates the Folsom nightlife, it is not true that leather is dead. There is still a large and viable gay male leather community, and much of it is still centered south of Market.
Thank you for sharing that, Joe. Do you have any other remarks that you wanted to make?
No, thank you for the opportunity. Amy and I spent a lot of time developing that work, so it's really lovely to have an opportunity to show some of it a few years later.